For the past 25 years, our main characters within Resident Evil have faced off against several different types of BOWs and have taken down many different bioterrorist organizations. And in those 25 years, they have all naturally aged, except of course Jill Valentine, who has recently been retconned to have slow aging ever since the events of Resident Evil 3. But aside from that, everyone else has aged 25 years. And that's something that I've kind of wondered about is, at what point will Capcom introduce the next generation to sort of take things over and be the next group to sort of lead the series forward? Because that's always something that I've kind of wondered about, because Resident Evil is a series that traditionally kind of follows the timeline of our actual time. And so all the characters are aging just as we are, and you have to think at some point characters like Leon and Chris are going to have to take a back seat so that the new generation can sort of take over. And I always felt like the Resident Evil 5 and 6 group that we were introduced to was going to be that generation to sort of take over. Characters like Sheva, Jake, Sherry, Helena, Mora from Resident Evil Revelations 2, like I always felt like those characters were going to be the next group to take over the series. But we just haven't had the time to see that happen because, as we all know, 7 and 8 kind of took things in a different direction with Ethan Winters and his story, and so the other characters just haven't had any time to show back up yet. But I'm hopeful that we'll finally get to see them all reappear again, maybe in Resident Evil 9 or somewhere beyond that, because Ethan Winters and his whole story is over with now, so the other characters can now have a chance to shine once again and maybe take over the mantle of being the next group that we follow. Now, something that I would like to see is for Resident Evil 9 to sort of give our original cast of characters some closure. I would really like to see Resident Evil 9 focus in on the main cast that we started this whole adventure with and give them proper closure. That's just something that I would really like to see, and they of course don't have to have it all happen in Resident Evil 9. They could split it apart. Maybe Chris, Jill, and Claire have their moment of closure in Resident Evil 9, and then maybe a possible Revelations 3, we have Leon and Ada receive their closure. So something like that could potentially happen, and I would be fine if they did it that way. But I just want to see those characters have their stories wrapped up properly. And then once that happens, then they could introduce the next generation to kind of take over the series. And from there, it would be really interesting to see whether or not they bring back the previous characters that I mentioned earlier, or will they introduce a brand new cast of characters to replace our original group. Me personally, I would prefer to see the previous group of characters from Resident Evil 5 and 6 make a return, because I liked a lot of those characters and they really did mirror really well with the original group. For example, I feel like Sherry would have been a really good replacement for Leon because they both survived Raccoon City and they both became government agents in the DSO. So they have that similarity right there. Another example would be Ada and Jake are very similar in that they were both mercenaries, and then both of their characters were impacted and changed by Leon and Sherry. So they have that similarity there. And so you have examples like that. I mean, Mora, she's working in TerraSave like Claire. I mean, it was all right there. So I would really like to see that group come back and be the ones to replace the original group, because they fit so well and it would just feel so natural. But if Capcom does choose to introduce a new group, I would be okay with it so long as they're interesting characters. And that's my big concern, because me personally, I was not a big fan of Ethan Winters, nor was I a big fan of Rose Winters. They just never really were that all interesting to me. And so if Capcom introduces a new cast of characters to replace the original, I would really hope they're not like Ethan and Rose. I would really prefer that they be more similar to characters like Jake, Sherry, Sheva, because as I previously had mentioned, I really liked those characters and thought that they were a really natural selection of characters to replace the original group given their similarities. But we shall see what Capcom ends up doing with that. Another thing that I was thinking about is given that Jill has this whole slow aging thing now, it's very likely that she will be sort of the leader of the next generation because of the amount of experience that she has and the fact that she is still youthful. And so it's very likely that she will end up being sort of the next Chris Redfield in a way, as in she'll be the one who's on the front lines facing off against BOWs, while Chris will maybe take a back seat with things and start to do more behind the scenes office work, paperwork, stuff like that due to his age. And I'm referring to like Shadows of Rose era Resident Evil, where we know Chris is still active with the BSAA, the Hound Wolf Squad. Like, we know he's still with them, but is he still on the front lines? Because as we all know, Shadows of Rose takes place 16 years after the events of Resident Evil 8, and Chris would be somewhere around his 60s at that point in time, like his mid-60s, and so he definitely could pull it off because he is Chris after all, and so I'm positive he would stay in shape, but still, he is human, and you gotta think that his age would catch up to him to some degree, and it would just make sense for him to sort of take a step back and allow for the next generation to kind of take over. And it would also be kind of a switch up on how things had been for a while, where Chris was the one on the front lines taking down the BOWs and saving the world and doing all this stuff, while Jill was having to go through rehab for many years. So it would be kind of a switch up on the characters, where now it's Jill on the front lines having all the action and taking down BOWs, while Chris is having to allow his age to take over and maybe do a little behind the scenes work instead. So I think that would work really well with his character, and we would still have Jill on the front line, so we would still have that one iconic character from the original group sort of leading the charge for the next generation. So I think it'd be a really cool thing if they wanted to go and take things in that sort of way. But we'll just have to wait and see what Capcom plans in terms of the next group to take over. Does Capcom even have plans for it? Will we see it maybe come Resident Evil 9 or maybe after Resident Evil 9? I'm not really sure, but I hope Capcom has some sort of plan. I'm hoping they're not thinking of just rolling with the original group until the end of the whole thing and that's it, and we never see anyone else, or that they make everyone slow aging like Jill. I don't think that will happen, but hopefully we'll see something soon enough. But what are your thoughts? Do you want to see the next generation, or do you want to see our original group keep on going? And if you do want to see a new generation, do you want to see, like I was mentioning, the group from Resident Evil 5 and 6 show back up, like Sheva and Jake and Sherry? Or would you prefer to see a brand new cast of characters sort of show up and take over instead? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video here, and I shall see you all on the next one. See you then.